Welcome to another episode of Living the Dream. I'm your host and moderator. My name is Gregory Tucker. Today, this episode is going to be one of the most amazing episodes there is. We have a pioneer and a educator. He's going to take us behind the scenes of what it really means to be an author. Today we have Mr. Gerald Everett Jones. Gerald, thank you for joining us.
Gregory, it's a delight to be with you, and I'm so impressed by my background. Thank you.
And as we always like to start off with asking our guests to tell us about yourself.
If you notice behind me here, you'll see in some moments, Preacher Stalls the Second Coming. There you go. This is the fourth in the Preacher Evan Wycliffe mystery series, the award-winning mystery series. And yes, I do have my own small press, my own imprint. And one of the award series that it received was in the New York City Big Book Awards, which accept submissions not only from small presses and indies, but also from major publishers. The Preacher Evan Wycliffe books won gold and silver in the same year. So those are the top two awards. And so that means they're better than everybody in mystery, at least in 2020. This is my 14th novel. This one is coming out in March. And the fans have been waiting 2 years for this particular one. And I will say, as we discussed off air, I have found a great difference, a marked difference between the process of writing business and technical books, and those were for mainstream publishers, and writing fiction, in my own small press, in my own entrepreneurial way. So I'm happy to share any and all of that with you today.
Breaking down that difference between making a technical nonfiction versus the fiction.
I had worked in the very beginning of my writing career, which was really when I got out of college. I failed in my audition at Juilliard as an actor. I got more discouraged than perhaps I should have gotten, and I went into advertising copywriting, and then from then into industrial film. And not long after I got involved in industrial film and corporate training, I became immersed in the early days of computer graphics. And that was back when it took an entire room to generate a business chart, an entire room of computers. And I learned enough about IT and computer technology that I could write business and technical books in that area. And so I made my living writing both books and trade magazine articles in the electronics and digital space, if you will. And I had a fairly high-powered agent at that time who was very prominent for being behind the Dummies books, for example. And when I told him years and years later that I was going to turn to writing fiction, he just basically said, "Have a nice life, kid." And so I backed into, indie publishing and small press. And as I say, I've published 14 novels and, 20 plus awards in various, not only mystery, but also romantic comedy. There's a three book romantic comedy series, what we might call skirt chasing in the pre-Me Too world. And then also literary fiction, historical fiction. And I entertain myself greatly by by doing fiction. But I will say that when I wrote business books, again, for mainstream publishers, I had to submit an outline and a proposal, and I was assigned an editor. And if I departed from that outline, I got my wrist slapped. And it was a very structured process, 1 and 2 chapters a week, 10 weeks max, maybe, to do a book. And when I turned to writing fiction, it was interesting because I I had since moved over here to the left coast, Hollywood adjacent, right? And so I was writing spec screenplays, and I had written a romantic comedy called My Inflatable Friend. And it had to do with as much with the main character's ego as it did with anything else. But that I had thought I would make that as an indie movie, and that did not happen despite a lot of effort to do that. And so I decided to novelize it. Well, the screenplay became the outline. That was actually fairly easy to follow as an outline. But then when I went to write the second book in the series, I'd run out of that material. So what did I do? And I began to discover the process of, now they call it writing from seat of the pants. And I will say that I find that I entertain myself more that way. I delight myself more that way. And I believe that possibly I delight the reader more by that approach. Now, it can create some frustrations, and it can create some crossed wires. And I will say those can look like the dark night of the soul, the horse latitudes. But when you emerge from those, and you trust that you will, and to this point, I have. I have one book. Well, actually, it's been more than one. I have a group of beta readers who are colleagues, other writers. Among them, Marvin Wolf, the author of the Rabbi Ben series, and then also John Rachel, Blinders Keepers, and they have often told me that they have found surprises on the last page, and that was very gratifying to know. And it is by writing if you're frustrated, you ask yourself the question before you go to sleep at night, and you trust that in the morning somehow the solution will be there. I studied for a while with Lee David Zlotoff, who is the inventor of the MacGyver series. And he said that when he was beginning to write, he didn't have an office, and he couldn't afford an office. And he wrote at the Santa Monica Public Library. And when he was staring at what was then a blank yellow pad in the library, he was often stumped. And he discovered that if he got up and he walked around, somehow in the circuit of the library, any number of times, he would come up with the idea, and he would be able to sit back down and write. But the other thing that he discovered was he had to have a goal in this walking. He had to tell himself, oh, I'm going to browse the history section, or I'm going to be looking at biography. He had to have a goal, because otherwise the librarians would chase him down and accuse him of being a vagrant and toss him out of the library. So, yes, a pantser. And that wasn't an expression when I set out. I think that's more, certainly I do use structure, and I am aware of AI tools, for example, that will give you plot suggestions and character descriptions, and I'm familiar with those. I don't really use them. I do use some of the more sophisticated grammar checkers before I give it to the copy editor. I just try to wring everything out of it that could possibly be corrected before I send it on. And even then, I make mistakes. The copy editor makes mistakes. The beta readers make mistakes. Finding typos in your own book has to be like a sinking feeling. I mean, it happens, and it's like we've only been over this 30 times, and yet, I'm a huge fan of John le Carre, the late John le Carre, alias David Cornwell, and I have read his books a number of times, so much so that I have found the typos in his books. So, um, yes, John le Carre, I think probably has taught me more than any writing instructor I ever had, any professor, even though I've had some good ones. But as I often say, and I'm fond of remembering, Le Carre writes of spies in his novels as close observers. He uses the term close observer. And you begin to realize that as a reader, what else are you? You're absorbing detail. He's throwing detail at you. Some of these details are going to be meaningful. Some are going to figure in later in the book. You go, I wish I remembered that. But in teaching you to be a close observer and teaching you to be a spy, in effect, okay, sit in a restaurant and watch people come and go, and it's like, well, why is he avoiding him, and why is he with her, and you know, they don't seem to be talking. They're staring at their phones. Well, this detail, by teaching you to be a close observer, he not only teaches you to absorb information from the text, he teaches you how to read between the lines, which is, again, if we're trying to be, in the old days, they said paranoia is just a heightened state of awareness. That's really the mindset that you have to have in reading a Le Carre spy novel, because a lot of it's not going to be there. You're going to have to look behind the scenes and guess at the motivations and agendas and plots of some of the, particularly the bad actors.
Now, when you first began your career, did you always start out knowing that, hey, I'm going to be an author? I'm going to write X amount of books and they're going to be fiction. You had mentioned that you initially started your career writing technical journals or books. So, what was an inspiration that got you started along the path of writing?
Well, in the early days, I always had the faith that I was going to feed myself and then later feed my family. And that was an extremely strong motivation to do, whatever assignment was across my desk. And if I didn't have any assignments, I learned how to pitch. I pitched magazine articles. I became an authority on digital multimeters. And I wrote practically every article for Beckman Industrial that appeared in the trade press for years. And that was very richly paid in those days. You don't see as many trade articles these days because there are websites, and those websites are changeable and volatile, not like the magazine trade, which was, somewhat, it wasn't etched in stone, but, those were monthly or quarterly journals, say. And so I had an editor at that time. My very first freelance job as a book editor was for what back then was called a book packager. And they had contracts with some of the major publishing companies to produce entire series of textbooks. So I was the senior editor and, in fact, the ghostwriter on 15 titles in the computer information series textbooks. And that senior editor, the fellow who was my supervisor, he said, there's just one piece of advice I'll give you is I want your butt in a chair every morning. And that became great discipline. And so if you talk about the faith you will get it done, you get it done because you needed to get it done. And then later I read an evaluation that he had given someone else about me that had been confidential, but he said, Gerald is the kind of person who would write on scratch paper, on napkins, in the back of matchbooks if he couldn't do anything else. So he basically accused me of being, a compulsory wordsmith. But see, thinking back on it, I had always been a storyteller on the playground at school. I mean, I was something of an introvert, but if you gave me an excuse to tell a story, I mean, even if it was a Bible story I'd heard in Sunday school, I'd be, you know, please forgive me, embellishing the story that I had been told. So
So,
that's part of that. That's part of the confidence is if you're not doing it for the first time, then it does become easier. I won't say that the resolution of the plots. This last one, Preacher Stalls the Second Coming, is an extremely complex plot, and it's got elements of non-based reality, virtual VR. It's got internment camps and homelessness. It's got political intrigue and bad actors and political agendas and land grabs, and it's all set in rural southern Missouri, where my going 2 generations back, my family is from. So that threading those pieces together was challenging, but I even at the most discouraging times, I did feel as though I was going to get to the end, and it's been rare that I have abandoned any project, be it paying or non-paying.
and
I like to get it done.
okay, and I'd like to dive a little bit more into your story, the Preacher series. But before we go there, let's go to you receiving your first rejection letter.
I remember a rejection letter very vividly, and I don't know that it was my first, but I had written this. I think it was the first screenplay that I wrote, which was a melodrama about a struggling actress who was a single parent, and her son was disturbed and needed special treatment, and she was just up against all kinds of things. But of course, there was this sleazy movie executive who all he wanted to do was just basically take advantage of her. So that was the plot. And I had a friend who was a movie director, um, and he he had a connection somehow to Dory Sherry, the famous executive producer of RKO back in the day, uh, really a legend in Hollywood. And I didn't even, at that time, I want to say this was probably the 1970s at some point. I wasn't even aware that, I just assumed people of that age had passed away or they'd gone into retirement homes or something. But evidently, Dory Sherry was still in the business. And so my friend got this script to Dory Sherry, and 6 months later, I got a letter back. And the first line of the letter was, I wanted very much to like this script.
Wow.
It might have been one of the kindest and gentlest set downs that, that I received, but I should have framed it. I don't know where it is. Maybe I have it among my memorabilia, you know. But I remember that one vividly.
Okay. And the reason I bring that up is because of our podcast. It's about that journey of as being an entrepreneur, because as an author, you are an entrepreneur right there. And that is in order to feed yourself and your family, you have to produce stories, a product that there's an audience for. Now, with that out of the way, let's go into the Preacher series. Why that particular, or what led you to creating the first installment or developing that character?
I had written a crime drama, a pretty true crime novel called Chokehold, which was actually about a true case of wrongful death alleged to the police. And I had a very dear friend who was the attorney who successfully represented the victim's family. And so I did that as with him as the expert witness, if you will. And so you could say that I'd written a mystery thriller. It was definitely constructed that way, but I hadn't done any other mysteries. And there was a mystery in my own family that really dogged me. And one of my relatives had died by suicide, and the circumstances were somewhat mysterious. And it had to do, presumably, although no one still knows for sure, but it had to do with presumably with some disagreement over the estate of the last generation of the older people had died, and she owned a farmhouse in southern Missouri, which is where these books are set. And as near as we could determine, he felt as though he'd somehow done a poor job as executor of the estate. And that was really about as much as we knew. Now, when I looked into it, I found that land sales in this part of the country, in the middle part of Missouri, just north of the Lake of the Ozark, in basically farm plains country, land titles are not necessarily all that clear. The Indians were driven out of Kansas and Missouri to Oklahoma in the 1830s, and hence the plot of Killers of the Flower Moon, which that's the Osage tribe, but those people were in southern Missouri. And so the feds, Union soldiers, well, it wasn't the Union then, it was the feds, drove not only Indians off, but at the beginning of the Civil War, they came around to farmhouses and they urged people off their land. And they said, this is going to be a battle zone, and we're going to basically evacuate, and you're going to have to come back after the war. Well, the problem was people left their homes, but they didn't really have paperwork to prove that they owned them. And it might have been a handshake, or it might have been a tenant farmer kind of situation. So when they returned to their homes, they were just as likely to be occupied by squatters after the war. And then there's a big dispute about whose house is this. So there wasn't necessarily any clear title to that farmhouse. And so I then modeled the reluctant investigator from the series basically on my background, not on the facts of my background, but I was a student minister, raised as a Southern Baptist. You could say now I'm a profound I don't knowist or a New Age theologian or something like that. But I had that. I was steeped in that background, and so I had a farm boy from Appleton City who intended to be a minister, and he went away. He was bright kid, gets a scholarship, goes away to Harvard Divinity School, finds out too much about the history of the Christian church, and drops out. Okay. And so he goes from there into MIT because he got some talent in science, decides he's going to discover astrophysics, finds no particular answers there, drops out of that. Then he's kind of unlucky in love, seriously unlucky in love, and moves back to southern Missouri, where there are no jobs in family farming in that part of the world. And so he gets occasional money as a guest preacher, and also he's a skip tracer. He's a bill collector for the local car dealership. And it turns out that people start coming to him with problems that no one else wants to solve. And he gets something of a reputation as both a agnostic, because his sermons are often about doubt and questioning and his curious mind, and also faith healer, because then later during COVID, he's visiting the sick and dying in the hospital, and there are these near-death experiences, and he knows enough science to know that that's not witchcraft. So the plot of Preacher Finds a Corpse, which is the very first in the series, is he finds not a relative, he finds his best friend, his childhood best boyhood friend, shot to death in a cornfield. And it's pretty clear it's suicide. But the question is, all right, I don't think Bob would do this to himself, but the coroner thinks so, the sheriff thinks so. But even then, what if someone drove him to it? If that's not murder, it's at least a sin. I want to find out who that was. So that's the engine of drama in the first book. And in the second one, he's got a couple of teenage kids. One's got schizophrenia, the other one epilepsy. One is accused of raping the other. Then the girl is abducted from the home where she's staying, and he's got to find out what's going on with that. So he stumbles into a teen trafficking ring. And in the third one, he's married at that point, and he's actually stepped into the role of minister because the older minister from the church is retired, and there's nobody else to fill the role. So right at the beginning of COVID, Evan, he's visiting the sick and the dying, he's performing weddings, and he's attending funerals, officiating at funerals. And then lo and behold, his wife is struck down in an automobile accident, and she's in a coma. Well, what does a clergyman do when you're being asked, you're a faith healer, can't you get your wife, can't you ask God to intervene? What are you going to do? And so then in this last one, which is, it turns out there was actually a plot by the U.S. intelligence community back in the 1960s to fake the second coming of Christ. And they were going to park a submarine off the coast of Cuba and set off a bunch of fireworks and loudspeaker. And they knew that they couldn't convince the entire world. They just were going to try to convince faithful Cubans to stand up against Castro by calling him the Antichrist. Well, as far as I know, that was never attempted, and Plan B was, the exploding cigars in those days. But it was only after I got into researching the book that I learned that there is a conspiracy theory, which is still active in some quarters, that maintains that NASA and the deep state are planning to use virtual reality to convince everybody Christ has come again. And I thought, well, this is pretty ridiculous. But then also we've got these discussions in the political quarters in this campaign year about internment camps. And I thought, okay, unscrupulous evangelist, luring people to a retreat, a rural compound that he owns. And he's luring disadvantaged people and homeless people there on promises of food. And he's preaching the end times, saying you got to be ready for the end times. But he's not feeding them. He's telling them to fast, and he's encouraging them to starve. Well, we're back in the same situation. If he drives somebody to suicide, is that a sin? It certainly sounds like murder. Well, the other problem is that the politicians are not particularly unhappy that the homeless people are just disappearing from the streets. These people are going there presumably voluntarily. So we've got all that going on, and then we've got also people in this part of especially in this part of Missouri, land grabs and casino culture, and turning farmland into developments and tourist attractions. We've got all that dynamic going on as well. So you got all kinds of bad actors here. And when one of Evan's congregation disappears, a young lady disappears into the compound, into this evil preacher's compound, Evan has no choice but to try to find out what happened to her.
So in developing the series, because that's a lot to unpack right there. So
it's a good read. Yes, it's a lot of detail, as John le Carre would say. You better be a close observer. You might miss it.
And that was bringing me to my next thing, and that was the observation of today's the different events or circumstances that are taking place today. That you package those right there, and you put those into somewhat of a what if.
Well, that was a serious consideration, especially when it came to taking something that was like the Jonestown Massacre, for example, which occurred in a third world country in a rural area where it wasn't difficult for people to go missing and for them not to be traced. But if I try to put this in the middle of southern Missouri, the question in my mind was, in this day of high technology, advanced technology, GPS mapping and Google drones flying all over everything, how are you going to disguise the fact that you've got, a few hundred people who've checked in there? And I began to realize that no, in some ways it's even more possible now, because the minute you have any evidence of malicious deeds, and certainly if there happen to be corpses and burials and those kinds of things, the minute you have that, you've got factions, you've got bad actors who want to obscure the facts, and so you've got social media saying, "Oh yes, you saw those film clips of them unearthing those bodies from the End Times farm. No, those body bags were just filled with pillows. That's the deep state trying to con you." Okay, and then you've got, oh no, they were eating babies there, or no, it was Martians, or it was UFOs coming out of the Bermuda Triangle. I mean, one of the things that every intelligence agency on the planet understands is there's no way to hide the truth anymore. The truth is there. The problem is it's buried in 20 versions of the story that are mostly untrue, some of which are completely wacko. And so when the truth comes out, all the bad actors have to do is point to the wacko one and say, "Oh, it's one of those. It's just like that."
So this is a era of dis and misinformation.
Post-truth world. That's the label they're giving it.
Okay. It's amazing. And we can go on about so many things that are in. But you had mentioned something earlier, and that was with AI, that now it's possible for authors to kind of kick start the thought process right there. Sometimes you'll see like YouTube videos and they'll say, well, create, do a novel in, an hour, 2 days, just use AI. As a established author and as a author, a practitioner that spans many years, tell us about the pros and the cons of using AR.
I see it as a thought starter. I mean, certainly you can do plot generator, and if there's a chapter that you're stuck on, or if you want to get a colorful profile of a character that you're creating, and you describe their profession, say, and their appearance, maybe their age, their race, something like that. Um, so it's a thought starter. It certainly can be used in that way, and there's a number of tools that are aimed specifically at writers that will do that. And then there's also, the sophisticated copy checkers, the grammar and style checkers that do. Potentially, those will save you money on copy editing because you can catch a lot of the errors, not all of them, and you have to know which flagged items to avoid or overrule. But you can, before you send to the copy editor, it's good routine to at least use the checker that's inside, say, Microsoft Word, which gets more robust every day and starts looking a little bit more like AI because it's suggesting your next word. And that's true on your phone too. It guesses the next word. But as we get into, for example, current political campaign, yes, you've got fake ads or you've got staged events. And one of the things that really struck me about it was a few years ago when I believe it was Kellyanne Conway invented the phrase alternative facts. And there was such laughter and derision that, this was an oxymoron. Of course, there can't be alternative facts. But I added a chapter I have a nonfiction book called How to Lie with Charts that is taught at places like Georgetown, so blame me. I added 2 chapters to that book in the recent edition, how to generate fake news, 11 ways to generate fake news, and how to abuse metadata. And one of the ways to generate fake news is simply to accuse your accuser before you're accused. If you're going to be accused of some crime, then before they make their press announcement accusing you, you've come out with an announcement and you've got video on it or what well, they did just as bad or worse. We see that every day. Okay, just about every congressional committee. And the other thing that fascinates, so you've got alternative sets of facts. Now, there you've got something that's really very much more sophisticated than alternative facts. Alternative sets of facts is either I deliberately left out some of the facts, including the fact that I struck him first before he punched back, or the investigation is so early and this is being reported so knee-jerk that some of the salient and essential facts simply aren't known yet. I mean, for example, when a coroner, I know this from Chokehold, the wrongful death story that I wrote, I know that a coroner can only make one of 2 judgments. The person died at the hands of another, or they died of natural causes. There's no third choice. So, but if they died at the hands of another, the coroner makes no judgment as to even how that specifically happened. Okay, it looks like foul play, but the coroner can't say, "Oh, I know who did it." That's for a criminal decision proceeding. That's for an indictment to be made, or grand jury investigation, or it's a completely separate legal process. And yet, there are grand jury verdicts that come down because there are, shall we say, unscrupulous actors, if not bad actors, who would rather the verdict simply be they died of natural causes and then everybody goes home. There won't be any criminal trial. But a very common coroner's verdict that you will hear, and you've heard it recently, died of a heart attack while being taken into custody, resisted arrest, blood pressure went up, caused stroke or cardiac, infarction. And that is a very common coroner's verdict, but it is when a civil, usually it may be that a criminal case can't come out of that because of the coroner's verdict, but the family might bring a civil case, and then the civil case might bring out the facts. And it turns out, well, yes, it looks like there's a lateral bruise on this side of the neck. Of course, his skin is so dark, the difference between that and the bruise would be hard to miss. But it's possible that a billy club was held against that carotid artery long enough that he passed out and then succumbed. And that has happened more than once, many, many more times than once. So I would argue that in this post-truth world, that one way to get things going in the case of a suspicious death is to hold a coroner's inquest, because a coroner's inquest doesn't have to wait years. It can't wait years for discovery and jury selection and whatever all. A coroner's inquest usually occurs within weeks of a death. And if then there's a judgment, this person died at the hands of another, then the public kind of knows, watch this space for the follow-up story. There will be an investigative reporter who's going to get to the bottom of that if they have to dig for years. It will happen. At least it will in the current environment, unless they get, muzzled in the future. Mm-hmm. But, that's the thing about newspaper reporting is, and media in general, is it's, as I say, you can't hide the truth. So when there's an event, you probably are going to learn about the event. You're probably going to know that it happened. You may know the presumed killer is still at large, or you may hear something like the story is finished, of the motivation for this crime is under investigation, not understood. The question is, will you ever read the follow-up to that story? Will anyone bother to pursue it? And again, this is coming back to the essence of the Preacher, Evan Wycliffe engine of those books, is people in this small town go to Evan because the sheriff closed the file and, he doesn't have the budget to pursue it and not enough evidence. But, it turns out the sheriff is one of Evan's good friends, and the sheriff's happy to buy him a couple of fingers of bourbon. Oh, that's right. He's a flawed character. Evan hits the bottle from time to time. But the sheriff's happy to buy him a drink and say, Evan, I'm not going to tell you to dig into this, but if you do, I want to be the first one to know anything you find out. Sheriff, that's a deal. And, I have the sheriff of St. Clair County being an African-American man who's significantly abusing his diet and has high blood pressure himself and has no budget, no help, getting pressure from above not to pursue anything. And, Evan just respects the hell out of this guy. He's like, he's hanging on by his chubby fingernails because this is a damn tough job in a really tough part of the country.
So Gerald, do you foresee, as far as your Preacher series, as becoming a movie or a streaming series?
I will say this. I think it's well suited to that. I mean, I have every one of my 14 books. I was like, I'll give you the name of my entertainment attorney. Just let us have your price. And I have one. I have a guy. Anyhow, I don't trust agents, but I have an attorney. But one of the things I will say especially about the Preacher series, as I would say about Succession, say, okay, you can't take anymore a book and create the Reader's Digest version of it and cram it into 2 hours. People just don't want only a feature film, okay? Yes, they get done. Feature films, if they're character-driven drama, they are going to get done because some actor wants that as an award picture. That's typically why they'll do it. The others tend to be, Marvel Comics. But one of the things that streaming and cable series and binge watching has done to really transform the art form, just as digital music recording has transformed the art form, just as the economics of stadium concerts, with an audience of 24,000 people, 70,000 people, with this mega wealth of Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Weeknd. That's the economics of distribution have changed fundamentally. So binge watching an entire series of 13, it used to be 13 episodes for TV series, but now it doesn't have to be. It's any number of episodes. Okay, if it's a mini series, it needs 4 episodes. It can. I watched a Turkish soap opera murder mystery series that was shot in Istanbul, 159 episodes. I didn't have anything else to do during COVID, my wife and I. So there's no limit. What I often say is I never walked out of a feature film. I never walked out of a movie theater and said to myself, I miss those guys. But if I binge watch Succession over a weekend, or even Licari's The Night Manager, brilliant mini TV series, BBC, yes. I sincerely, there's an emotional attachment I have to those characters. And it's because you can take an entire chapter for an episode. You can explore character development. You can see not only the motivations of the main character, but the supporting characters. You can see the motivation of the person behind the bar. You can see into the heart of the villains and bad actors. I mean, in one of the impressive things about an Ann Tyler book, which is really kind of been hard to do in movies made from her book, is that she often presents both sides of all the characters, such that there might be a bad boy in there, but in some of her novels, the bad boy ends up being your favorite character by the end, and you kind of understand exactly where he's coming from. That's hard to do in a feature film. It's very possible because what binge watching and streaming has done is take us back to the days of Balzac and Dickens. Each chapter was an episode in the newspaper. A newspaper might come out when it was printed, maybe not even just once a week. And supposedly in Dickens' day, there were people waiting on the dock for the ship to show up with the newspapers so they could read the latest chapter, in Great Expectations or whatever happened to be. I don't know which one was serialized. I know a lot of them were. But Balzac, his stuff get the guy an editor. His stuff just goes on detail upon detail. One of my favorite novels of Balzac, A Harlot High and Low. I could write that plot. Rags to riches, back to rags. Wow. What a wonderful, and this guy, very commercial. And, Stendhal said of Balzac and this is 1814, Stendhal wrote The Red and the Black, the red being the clergy and the black being the military, and a novel. And he said, the people in Paris, as backbiting and vicious as they are in society, they are wiser than the people in the country. And the way he explained that was the people in Paris read Balzac's novels and they know the consequences of their evil deeds, so they don't necessarily do them.
It's interesting. That's interesting. Well, Gerald, this has been an honor as far as sitting here, having an opportunity to talk with you and also to explore your history as far as in literature. Now, how can more of our viewers or our audience who want to read more of the series and some of your work, how can they get in contact with you?
Well, it's GeraldEverettJones.com, and you see there Gerald with a G and Everett with 2 T's. And no, I'm not Jerry Jones. I do not own the Dallas Cowboys. But if you go to that website, you will find free electronic review copies of some books. You will find the full list of 14 books. You will find some more on my background. You'll find a way to contact me through the contact page. And also I have a blog on Substack called Thinking About Thinking. And that is also GeraldEverettJones.substack.com. And I typically push out a post a couple of times a week. And I often will review novels by other authors that have affected me, that I feel as though, and there's a selfish reason for that. It's like, well, if you like Paul Auster, you'll like me. But I'll introduce you to people like Michel Houellebecq, who is very widely regarded in Europe. But I don't think there are that many people who read him here. Maybe that's true. They're probably making a movie out of something like about his. But Michel Houellebecq, I respect a lot. He, even though he's a cynic, and I have trouble sometimes getting through the anguish in some of his books, but they're fascinating. They're psychologically just fascinating. And so I will acquaint you with a book that I've read recently, and an author that I respect. And yes, I have covered quite a few of John le Carré's books. I recently covered Silverwood, which is his last book that his son published for him posthumously, because the manuscript was left unfinished in his desk, but it turned out it wasn't finished. He was just afraid of it being published because it might be his last one. And it was. So, but fascinating story about the spy community kind of turning in on itself. And, le Carré always said that a measure of a nation's character is its intelligence agencies. I don't know how far to push that, but he did believe that the European alliance was turning in on itself, and that, in some ways, the Yankees were as much the bad guys as anybody, and so that commie John le Carré.
So there's quite a number of plot twists, as far as in your work and many others' work that's throughout the world that you evaluate right there. Gerald, what advice or suggestions would you give a up-and-coming author?
Well, the advice that I got about put your butt in the chair every day, that's a good one. These days I can only work diligently for 4 or 5 hours, and I have to either have lunch or a nap. So I confess that I'm not pushing in the long days, but I do write pretty much every day, and I do even developmental editing. I'll do manuscript evaluation for authors, and just basically give them and not necessarily commercial perspective, although, having studied screenwriting and 3-act structure and storytelling and techniques, yes, I have pretty strong opinions about what works as a story and what doesn't. That doesn't necessarily mean it's commercial, but I think it does make it a yarn that's worth reading. And I don't hold with confusing literature and entertainment. I don't like the word entertainment for movies or for books. I think that, art and culture are much more than entertainment. It's not a way to fritter away the time. It's not eye candy, and it's not, self-aggrandizement or ego puffery or anything like that. It has a lot to do with human beings being storytellers and trying to build community, trying to communicate lessons learned with each other. So I would say that, and then I would also say curiosity. If you can, if a teacher can teach a kid curiosity, done. That's the best thing that's the best give you can give a human being is, and with all the resources available to us at your fingertips, and it's like, hello Bing, hello Siri, hello Google, just search for it. Somebody's going to give you an answer. Now, you might not trust that answer, but guess what? You're gonna find out stuff you don't know. And that was a favorite saying of my dad, the businessman. It's like, I'd ask him a question and say, well, why don't you go there? I don't know what you're going to find out, but I guarantee you're going to know more than you do today.
That is great advice right there. And what I'm taking away from it, and that is, whatever you do, stay curious. Thank you again, Gerald. This has been an honor for us coming on the program.
I'm privileged to be asked, Gregory. I'd be happy to be back, and I can say to all of you, fans, practitioners, artists, laborers in the Valley, rock on, carry on, fear not.
Thank you again, sir. I want to try a couple of new things. First of all, I want to try to make an intentional effort to be more consistent this year. That's going to be a proposition that I'm going to make to you for diligently following the program or the podcast, this channel over the years. The second thing is, as mentioned far as on our landing page, and that is we want to talk to real people about real stuff and how they took their journey, turning their dream into a reality. So we'll unpack some things as we go along. Now, I have managed to successfully record several interviews prior to this year, so that will help me as towards being consistent. One of the other things, and that is over the years, you probably noticed that the surroundings, if you've tuned into the channel, you'll notice that the set has changed over a number of times, and that is I've had to pivot, and that's one of the things that we'll be talking about because that's a real life occurrence as far as with many of us, and that is occasionally throughout our journey through this thing called life, we do have moments we need to pivot. Every day, if you're not learning something, then that means you're not growing.